fell into the drink. This story has inspired many others. Among them, there's a story about Mark Twain, who was visiting the Sea of Galilee with his wife Olivia. It was a nice moonlit evening, and Twain thought that it would be romantic to take his wife Livy for a ride in the boat on the lake. So he escorted her down to the lakeside, where they found a man with a rowboat. Twain asked him how much he would charge to take them out for a boat ride on the lake in the moonlight. The man, seeing that Twain was nicely dressed in a white suit and a Stetson hat, offered to take him out for $25. That was more than 100 years ago, and $25 was a lot of money in those days. In fact, if you go to an online inflation calculator, you can see that $25 would probably, in 1900, would probably be about $1,000 or maybe $750 in today's money. $750 for a rowboat ride in the moonlight. Well, Twain was a successful rider, and Olivia came from a wealthy family, but he could have afforded it, a $25 boat ride, but he was also a sensible man who didn't like being taken for a ride, as the old phrase goes. Andrew, I'm depending on you, okay? So he thanked the man, took his wife's arm, started back to their hotel. And as they left, Twain is reported to have said, "Now I know why Jesus walked." The story of Jesus walking on the water is found in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. So the early church obviously thought it was important. Matthew is writing his Gospel at a time when Christians are being persecuted. By this time, Peter has most likely been crucified. The storm stories in Matthew's Gospel address issues of danger, fear, and faith. And in these stories, the boat seems to represent the church, buffeted by temptations, trials, and persecutions. In both stories that we hear of these storms in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus appears as the church's champion, who is strong to save those who call on him in faith. In Matthew's version of today's story, Jesus, as Jesus explained, had just finished feeding the 5,000, starting with a handful of food, but all of them ate and were filled. A big miracle. Then Jesus decides to go up the mountain to pray by himself, so he dismissed the disciples. He told them to get into their boat and row to the other side of the lake. We usually call it the Sea of Galilee, but it's more like a big lake. It's about 21 kilometres long and 13 kilometres wide. It's not a huge lake, but it's a big one. You can get into trouble on a lake in a small boat. This lake was especially troublesome because of the way the hills formed along the shoreline of the lake. When the winds came up, as they often did, the hills would channel the wind down and across the lake. It could get pretty vicious in a hurry. Now, as you know, we've come most recently from Geneva, and Geneva is famous because there's a big lake there. I looked it up. It's not as big as the Sea of Galilee, but it's big enough, and it has the same kind of geography. It's surrounded by a fair few mountains. This is Switzerland, after all. Fair few mountains, and the same thing happens. We used to do one little crossing from the town near us called Nyon, and you could go across the lake, and then you're on the French side of the lake to a little shopping village called, a little tourist trap, let's be honest, called Ivoire, and you'd go across the lake, and it's great. We had no cars, so the only way we got anywhere was riding our bikes. So we would ride down to Nyon. That was okay because it's downhill. We'd get to Nyon, and then we'd want to go on the ferry to go across. A couple of times we got there, and the ferry was not going because there was just too much chop and waves for the boat to run. And this is not a rowboat. This is a ferry kind of boat on a lake in the middle of Switzerland. Yes, lakes can get rough, and storms and so on can make it pretty tough. But think now of a small rowing type fishing boat and a bunch of fishermen rowing out on a bigger lake. Well, the disciples did as they were told. They got into their boat, they started rowing, they rowed some more, but the wind was against them and they didn't make a lot of headway. If you've ever rowed a boat, you know it can be hard work. Probably, let me just check here. Yes, I don't think too many of us would last very long rowing a boat. But these guys were fishermen. Tough, muscled, determined. I reckon they would have been frustrated. But the story says nothing about them being afraid, at least not yet. They knew storms. They'd been out on this lake before, and they weren't afraid of this storm. Finally, during the fourth watch of the night, perhaps sometime between 3 a.m. and dawn, these disciples see Jesus walking towards them on the water. Then they were afraid. It wasn't the storm that scared them, it was Jesus. They thought they were seeing a ghost. How else could they explain a man walking on the water? But then they heard Jesus' voice over the sound of the wind. Cheer up. It's I, he said. Don't be afraid. Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. If it is you, isn't exactly an affirmation of faith. Peter's still feeling pretty nervous. Peter says, if it's you, and Jesus replied, come. So Peter stepped out of the boat into the water. I think he would have stepped out of perfectly good boats before, but probably in more shallow water and not in the middle of the lake, in the middle of a storm. The Bible also doesn't tell us what the disciples said to Peter at that point. I've only just had this thought, but I reckon the disciples, some of them would have said, what on earth are you doing, Peter? Get back in the boat. And some of the disciples may have said, good on you, Peter, you go for it. We certainly don't hear of any disciples saying, I'm with you, Peter, here I come. I've met all of those kind of disciples. Anyway, as soon as Peter gets out of the familiar boat and goes into the unfamiliar raging water, he says, whoops. The Bible actually doesn't have that bit where he says, whoops, or any other appropriate fisherman words. I'm not sure a fisherman would just say, oh, whoops-a-daisy. Anyway, we won't go into fisherman words. But it says, he saw the wind was strong and he was afraid, which is the Bible's way of saying, whoops. And then Peter began to sink. Some have suggested that you would expect Peter to sink. His name, of course, means the rock. So you'd expect him to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus stretched out his hand, took hold of him and said, you of little faith, why did you doubt? There's a two-way challenge here. Peter says, if it is you, Lord, and Jesus says, come. How do we test God? And how does God test us? There's a story of one lady who felt that she was called to preach and asked God for 10 signs. She was prepared to accept all the usual religious things. The words from hymns might speak to her, the urging of friends, a word from Scripture, something like that. But after these, she asked God to give her one final sign, something that couldn't be mistaken or incidental, like a flying pig. Following a service at which she felt God's call again, she left the church to walk home, and at the end of the road was a van displaying the company logo, a big flying pig. She was shocked but convinced. You of little faith, why do you doubt? When Matthew wrote this gospel, Christians were being persecuted. Peter was already dead. We think the Romans crucified him. Christians had stepped out in faith to join the church, just as Peter had stepped out of the boat in faith. Now they were scared. Scared to death. They wondered where God was. Was God dead? Was he hiding? Did he care? This story of Jesus and Peter in the midst of a storm reassured them in the face of their fear. This story spoke to them of salvation in the face of disaster. It told them that Jesus was with them, even in the midst of a raging storm of persecution. This was the then story. What's the now story? What does this old story of Jesus and a frightened apostle have to do with us here today? And surely the answer is that we too are afraid. Just like Peter, the things that we fear are often real. In Peter's case, he was afraid of the storm, of the wind and sea. As a fisherman who lived among other fishermen, he had undoubtedly known men who would have died in storms on the Sea of Galilee. Even today, commercial fishing is a dangerous occupation, one of the deadliest jobs around. A statistic I found was that commercial fishermen are 42 times more likely to die on the job than the average worker. And storms at sea are responsible for most of those deaths. So in that storm, Peter was afraid. He was afraid his time had come. He cried, "Lord, save me!" And in the midst of terrible persecution, the early church was afraid. "Lord, save us," they cried. And in the dark of night, we also are afraid. We're afraid of 1,000 things. Some of us are afraid of COVID-19. Some of us are afraid of dying. Others are afraid of running out of money as they get older. Some are afraid that no one will ever love them. At different points in our lives, we're afraid of 1,000 things. "Lord, save us," we cry. And when I listen to the prayer requests that come, or see those that have been written in our request book, I know of some of the things that frighten us. Illnesses, family issues, people we're worried about. We're afraid of many things. We're afraid of the price of petrol going up. "Lord, save us," we cry. Like Peter, we're afraid of storms. If we live here in Darwin, aren't we? And it just happened to be called cyclones. And we get worried if we hear that one is getting a bit too close. "Lord, save us," we cry. We're afraid of the other. During a war, we're told who the other is that we should fear. Now we're afraid of the other. I don't know who it is for you. The other might be the other workers who are going to take our jobs, or who are interfering in our politics or upsetting our economy. We're afraid of the other. Lord, save us, we cry. Have I hit one that rings for you yet? We're afraid of our economy. We see businesses struggling and closing. We hear predictions of leaving a debt burden for our future generations. Lord, save us, we cry. I'm afraid that I haven't done enough for vulnerable people in our midst. In Matthew 25, Jesus makes it clear that a great deal hangs on whether we give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty. A great deal hangs on whether we welcome the stranger and clothe the naked. A great deal hangs on whether we visit the sick and those in prison. Jesus' words, truly I tell you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Like most of you, I've helped some people, but I've failed to help others. Like most of you, I've sometimes stopped to render assistance, but on other times, I've passed by on the other side. What then shall we say when we meet Jesus on that final day? Last week I suggested I did what I could would be a good epitaph to have on your tombstone. This week I want to also confess that it would be foolish to say I did my best, because Jesus knows better. It would be foolish to list the things we've done right, because Jesus knows all the things we've done wrong. We can only cry, Lord, have mercy. Lord, save us. And when we cry, Lord, save us, just as he did with Peter, Jesus will say, come. We'll feel the tug of his strong arm pulling us upward. He'll say, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? And then he'll save us. When God calls us to step out of the boat, he doesn't leave us to sink. He's promised to be there with us in everything we do. And the Holy Spirit equips us with the strength and power that we need for every task and every situation. Peter often acted on impulse and failed and came to grief, as we know from many of the gospel stories. But he never finally failed, because always, at the moment of his failure, he held on to Jesus again. Someone said, a saint is not someone who never falls or fails. A saint is someone who gets up and goes on every time he falls. Peter's failures only made him love Jesus more. When he called on the Lord, he was lifted and saved. The moment when we are most strongly tempted to give up is probably the moment when help is, if only we knew it, just a step away. I want to remind you this morning that we're sitting in the nave of the church. The word nave comes from the Latin navis, a word which means boat or ship. And of course we get the word navy from it and so on. But the ship that we're in is not intended to be sitting by the dock. We're in the ship, but Jesus calls us